So thank you. It's fun to be in the big ballroom, and I can hear the echo of my own voice. But this is actually, from my point of view, a very good turnout. It doesn't look like that because of the hugeness of the room, but to get 30 people who actually want to hear a bunch of annoying policy stuff about nonprofits, I think is great. So let me start with about if the audio people can do something about the echo, I'd love it. Maybe just turn me down a little bit, I think. So I'm the president of this thing called the Software Freedom Conservancy, and I've been kicking around nonprofits for a number of years. And pretty much I haven't had a for-profit corporate job since 1996. So I've spent a long time in nonprofits. I actually did used to be a software developer, and I almost feel an obligation to point out this because I'm somewhat embarrassed that it's been so long since I wrote code regularly. Actually, as it turns out, the last project I was an active contributor to was a Python project. I'm mostly known for way back being in the Perl community, but I spent a couple of years, nights and weekends, contributing to a thing called PokerSource, which is an online poker application. It's all free software, and it's written using Python and Twisted. And Twisted is actually one of the Python projects that's a member of the Software Freedom Conservancy. But the reason I stopped doing software development and started doing this nonprofit management garbage is because I want developers who write free software to have the freedom to work on it and do things that they think is right for their projects. That's, I think, the most important thing that developers do in free software. But in some sense, the free software movement, which is now often called open source, is kind of a victim of its own success in a number of different ways. And it's changed the culture of how projects operate in some good ways, but also some problematic ways. And there's things that I'd like us to do as a community, general free software community, and as a Python community in addition to that, to help make a counterbalance to some of the changes of how free software has changed the last 20 years that I've been involved with it. So I started to focus a number of years ago on how to build structures in the not-for-profit space to allow for free software development. And I found that there's a big similarity in hacking organizations to hacking software, and that is that the details matter a great deal. There were lots of people who will walk around talking about great ideas of, oh, we could start an organization that will do this, that, and the other thing. And there's actually kind of a number of carcasses of nonprofits that ceased to exist over the years or became defunct because people had this great idea of starting a nonprofit to do something open source or free software related, and there wasn't really a culture of folks who wanted to work on that because most of the people that started the earliest open source and free software organizations, generally speaking, there were exceptions of course, PSF and Conservancy both being one of them, most of the people were software developers who didn't want to spend their time filing paperwork and learning IRS rules. And it's not actually that I like the fact that I know a whole lot about the US IRS regulations, more than I ever thought as a software developer I'd need to know. I felt it was necessary to do that work, and I'm somewhat of a masochist and willing to do it because I think it's good for free software. But most people don't want to do that, and most people, fortunately, in the world are not masochists like I am. So I spend my time working on these details of nonprofit management and how to build nonprofit structures that can benefit free software developers to allow them to write free software for the public good. Now, my next point is a gross oversimplification, and I apologize for that in advance because everyone in the audience will surely notice this. But there are really roughly two ways that projects get started in the free software and open source world these days. The one way is a company throws it over the wall, a great example being something like Android, which is more or less a Google project that is released as free software, kind of as an afterthought to serve Google's needs for that. And then there's the kinds of free software projects that I'm most historically familiar with, which is groups of volunteers or even just an individual who had some love for a project or excitement or a great idea, and they worked on it in their spare time, or they got their job to give them a little time to work on it, and they release it out there primarily as a labor of love at first, and then it becomes of interest to other people. The first type of project, it's not really a good fit for a charity like the one that I run. The organization I run is what's called a 501c3 charity in the U.S. That's an IRS tax code designation. I'm going to talk a little bit more detail in a few minutes, and there's other IRS tax code designations for nonprofits, and the most common one we find in the free software world alongside 501c3s are things called 501c6s. That's effectively the latter, a trade association. It's a group of companies who get together and decide they have a common business interest. The best example of a 501c6 is a Chamber of Commerce. So there's probably a Santa Clara Chamber of Commerce, and it's probably a 501c6 because all the businesses in Santa Clara love when a conference like this comes to town, and we use their restaurants, we use their hotels. So they all have a common business interest to bring PyCon to Santa Clara, and so they form an organization that's a nonprofit that just promotes the common business interest. The most recently formed C6 in our world is the OpenStack Foundation, which was formed by Rackspace and a number of other companies. Linux Foundation is also a C6, by the way. But the reasons that a C6 is a better match for a throw-it-over-the-wall kind of project will probably be on the scope. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, because I want to focus on the types of organizations that both Python Software Foundation and Conservancy are, which is a 501c3. And 501c3s have an interesting thing. They are focused on the public good to make the world a better place. And they have to file with the IRS sort of a document called a Form 1023 that declares the specific types of public good that the organization is going to do. And ultimately, Conservancy is really just focused on helping developers get their software out to users, to make open source and free software that's shared with everyone for the general public good so they can learn and understand and improve and deploy the software that's created. So I see my job as finding these ragtag band of volunteers who are writing free software, who want to make the world a better place, and giving them a nonprofit home where they can get stuff done, i.e. take over the organizational stuff that's not software development and documentation. So the developers focus on that, and Conservancy takes care of everything else. So I'm going to make a lot of points about how we need more of this kind of activity that I'm describing, but I don't want to deny that for-profit corporate interest in free software is an incredibly important component of how our software gets written. And it's not that we don't need them. We really do need those companies to continue contributing in basically the two ways they contribute. One is with financial contributions, which is why we have these banners around us, because they financially contributed to this conference, and also from the staff time that is given to projects to push code upstream. Both of those components are incredibly essential to how free software moves forward. The question I'm really focused in is not whether or not we should have that contribution. I concede completely that we should. What I'm focused on is what happens as far as who's in control of projects. Who drives these projects? Is it the companies or the individuals who contribute to them? And I really want to see the latter. I think what generally happens to keep free software projects moving ahead, it can be summarized in hackers will always find a way. I think most developers who care about free software projects that they contribute to find a way to give back, and there are places that are more friendly to this than others, and I've seen developers switch jobs so they can be at a job that will let them give back more. And the original idea that HP first innovated in the middle of the last century and Google has now made famous is a way that this happens. When you have a company that specifically has a policy to allow employees to sometimes give back to open source and free software projects, in Google's case 1 day a week, in HP's case a half day a week, this creates a culture whereby developers can contribute back to the projects that they care about. The thing is that the way this system works is a little bit more complicated and a little bit more dangerous than it actually looks. I think developers who work for for-profit companies face a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance. And I think that, like most cognitive dissonance, their goal is to resolve it, and they don't pay attention to it that often. the people who are funding them don't actually care if they contribute upstream. They do and they don't. They care for the usual open source reasons, which is, oh, we don't have to create a branch and we can have our changes that we want upstream. But that's what it's really about, getting the company's changes upstream, which means pushing the code bases in the direction that an individual corporation wants. And it's really tough for a developer to not feel somewhat obliged, probably rightly so, to try and push the code bases they contribute to in the direction that their company wants them to contribute, to push the code base to. It's not wrong. It's not that they're doing something dishonest. They were paid by the company. Of course, they should do their jobs. If you're paid by somebody, you should do the job you're paid for. And oftentimes, free software developers are paid to push code bases where companies want them to go. This is where free software gets its tragedy of the commons these days. 10 years ago, when I would give a talk about free software, everybody said, well, the tragedy of the commons is that everyone will take and prioritize this stuff and not give back. Generally speaking now, almost any company using free software, even the great enemies of our past like Microsoft and Apple, have some of their employees giving code back to upstream projects. So that's happening now. The tragedy of the commons becomes when the project serves its corporate masters more than it serves what the community of individual developers and users actually want. That's the thing that I want to provide and build a counterbalance to. I think that's what a charity, a free software charity, can do. I don't live with a lot of cognitive dissonance with regard to my job. I have a little, but not very much. Because the IRS, and I'm going to talk more about this in a minute, has me serving one specific master, the public good. Because I work for a charity all day, I have to make sure everything I do is in the benefit of the general public, to make the world a better place. I am really lucky to have a job where my only shareholder is the world, the people of the world who need better software. That's who I serve every day. And I want developers to have this same kind of experience. I want to build structures where free software developers only have to worry about the people who are using their software and say, I want to benefit all of them equally. I want to balance all the needs for both corporate users and both individual as well as individual users and find the best software. I want to solve this problem that this software is designed to solve in the best possible way, in the best technical, political, philosophical way that I can think of. And I want developers to just have that as their goal. So I promised a fundraising talk, and this actually does relate to fundraising. Because as I pointed out, free software doesn't exist without corporate contribution. But I also don't think that's the sole place we should be accepting contribution. We shouldn't expect any developer who wants to contribute to free software to have to go and find a job that would let them do it. Nonprofits, and I think Conservancy is showing, can be a hub of future funding. As it stands today, we have 7 different contributors on contract, either part-time or full-time, contributing to a variety of Python-related projects. The 3 biggest being, sorry, Twist is not capitalized there, it wasn't intentional. Mercurial, PyPy, and Twisted are the biggest Python projects we currently have. The people who contract with Conservancy are paid to work on free software. The community is effectively their boss. I put that in quotes because technically I am, but not really. The community is their boss. They have to put a monthly blog post, contractually obligated, by the way, to put a monthly blog post to the public about what they did that month. And they have to send me a commit log of the commits they made to the public that month before I'll release payment on their invoice. I think this is how free software can really be developed in a way that really is focused on serving the community. So this is a graph of the percentage of donations of where PyPy, which is one of the larger projects, financially speaking, in Conservancy, come from. And I admit that the majority of the donations there are from companies, and I just got through saying that, well, we don't want companies in control of software, and therefore we should have these nonprofits. But if the charity's getting more than 50% of its donations from a variety of companies, isn't that a problem? Well, it's not, because the IRS is a wonderful institution. Most of you in the United States experience the IRS as your tax authority, the place you have to pay your taxes to and file your 1024 every year. But it turns out, because of the way the charity structure works in the United States, the IRS is also the regulatory body for charities in the United States, because effectively a charity like a 501c3 is a government grant, because my organization pays no taxes, generally speaking, because it's a charity. And also, when someone donates to the charity, they get a tax deduction on their Schedule A Form 1040. You see how much of this I have to know now off the top of my head, to be able to contribute their money to it. And so they're this regulatory body that's deciding how these charities work. And that is actually useful, because I am prohibited by the IRS from letting any one company or group of companies to control the charity. And the reason the IRS is so strict about this is because if they weren't, everybody would use charities as a tax evasion tactic to just make I'll just make a charity of myself where the beneficiary is me, and you can donate to me, and every time you pay me, it's a tax deduction. Well, you can't do that, because there's lots of rules and regulations about that. And so when I accept a donation on behalf of the PyPy project into Conservancy, I can't promise the donor that they will do something specific. In fact, the PyPy project, to use that again as an example, came up with a list of things they wanted to do. They put that out to the public and then asked for donations. So that was already set in stone what was going to be happening with the money, and it was decided by the developers in the best interest of their users what they were going to do. And then they accept donations. Now, if those donations come from companies, that's fine, because those donations have to be spent to advance the public good. And if it turns out that I'm not making sure that happens, Conservancy is at risk of losing its charity status and being declared a company rather than a charity, and having to pay back taxes and all sorts of horrible things. So I have an incredible incentive to make sure that there isn't corporate control or any specific individual in control of how these projects work. The IRS effectively gives us this wonderful firewall. I don't have to tell the company that I don't have to take responsibility when I tell the company they can't control what happens with the donation. I said, well, hey, I'd love to let you control this whole project, but the IRS would take our charity status away, so I can't. Sorry. It's such an easy answer to be able to give to a donor. And I don't have to take the blame. I can just point the finger at the IRS, and most people don't like the IRS, so it makes it really easy. But I have to admit that this is slow going. Nonprofits always are. Even our largest projects, of which PyPy is one of them, which is why I use it as an example, only has about $100,000 a year coming through its specific earmarked account at Conservancy. Each of our projects has an earmarked account you can donate to. If you send a check to Conservancy and put PyPy in the memo, the money goes towards PyPy, not towards, 10% of it goes towards my salary and 90% goes towards PyPy. My salary and our one other employee, I should say. So the Conservancy as a whole, when we have 30-some projects, our annual revenue is only $1.7 million. So that's not very big when you compare it to the kinds of revenue that you see in the for-profit world. And so we can't change the world by ourselves, but I think we're doing our small part, because we're providing that counterbalance that I mentioned before, to make sure that there is a place where free software development can happen that's not under the control of any specific company. So this, I promise, is my only slide where I make a fundraising pitch. Well, actually, the next series of slides. But I would actually prefer to see, that's a typo on the slide. I would see less blue, I should say, in this graph. And every other, less blue. My apologies. That should be less, not more. Because I want to see the yellow much larger. I want to see more individuals giving to free software projects. Because we really need a culture where people say, hey, I care about this project. It's important to me personally that this project exists, and I'm going to give $20, $30, $40, $50 to help support it. I don't think we want to just sit here and say, well, companies will fund this stuff and it will always be there for us. I think we as individuals have to take a thing, and if you're in the United States, you get a tax deduction when you do it. And I said I didn't want blue bigger necessarily. I want the entire pie bigger, of course. And I think companies should give more cash rather than just staff time. And I think it's great that companies are sponsoring conferences like this. And I think we should encourage them to do more. If you work for a company, you should be encouraging them to give to the projects that they rely on. Now, there's an interesting problem on the other side of this question. And I discovered this last year when I walked around the trade show floor, when I realized nobody on the trade show, I haven't been there this year yet, I just got here, but last year there was nobody trying to sell anybody anything. They were trying to recruit developers. And I've never seen a trade show, Vicon was the first time I saw a trade show floor where it was like 95%, 98% recruitment. And I mean, usually it's like 10, 15% recruitment. So I think that there's a lot of jobs and there's a lot of well-paid jobs for free software developers, particularly in the Python community. And the fact of the matter is nonprofits don't pay that much. By the way, you can look up because I'm the executive of a nonprofit, I have to publicly disclose my salary. Now, I won't do it here. I'll make you go read our Form 990, because I think you should read the Form 990s of the organizations you donate to. So I always put that teaser out there that you can go download our Form 990 on our website right now and see how much I make a year. But you'll have to do that to find out. And we've lost contractors. There's, I think, people in this room that we've lost because they've found ways to make more money elsewhere doing various different things like working for Facebook or consultancies or all sorts of things that pay better than a nonprofit does. I submit, what matters more in your life? Make a little less money at a nonprofit and be having the master of the public good, or having Facebook as your master, right? I think it's an easy decision for me, but I also work for a charity. I think growth is hard in the nonprofit space. I think Conservancy is actually growing incredibly fast, because we went from 1 employee to 2 employees to 2.25 employees, and I hope to go to 3 in the next 2 years over a matter of 5 years total. A growth of 1 employee a year and 3 or 4 contractors a year, that's huge for a nonprofit. We're actually growing very, very quickly. And I hope that we can continue to grow, and I hope more nonprofits start doing this. I'd love to see lots of other nonprofits funding free software development. There is a political issue here. There are projects in Conservancy that have a rule they won't pay developers because it's politically complicated. And I've watched projects have a political problem when they start paying some of the developers directly by the project. My argument is you're just making it all gray by letting the companies pay for it and the companies sort of decide, rather than saying the project's going to pay a developer. But it's tough for some communities to get used to that idea. I think it's worth the political problems to actually fund free software developers through charities. And with that, I hope I have a few minutes left for questions. Oh, thank you. I saw your hand go up first there.
Yeah, so one of the things you mentioned is that nonprofits can't be controlled by corporations.
501, specifically 501c3 charities in the U.S. can't be controlled.
Okay, 501c3 charities in the U.S. can control the other 501c3 charities in the U.S.
The question is, they asked me to repeat the questions. The question is, can a 501c3 be controlled by another 501c3? Absolutely. That's absolutely fine. In fact, I was in a discussion with a project recently where it turned out a lot of the project leadership was affiliated with another C3 charity. And my answer was, we aren't really worried about that because it's not a problem because they're another C3. That can have a governance issue that's more of a general governance issue. It's not something the IRS would care about. The IRS would say, they're all C3s, we don't care. There's kind of this like C3 sinkhole, and then money and resources can't leave the C3 sinkhole once it's in it. Like, we can transfer money to another C3, no problem, it's very easy. Because the IRS doesn't care. It's all in the same tax code, tax regulation. As a governance matter, that can be hugely political, right? I mean, if Conservancy were to take, say, PyPy's money and give it to the Python Software Foundation for other Python projects, like, the IRS wouldn't care one whit. The PyPy community would be furious at me, and I actually am contractually bound not to do that with the PyPy community, but it's generally, from an IRS perspective, not an issue. I'm just going to start from left to right. Let's go all the way over there.
Can you speak a little bit about what's involved in setting one of these up? Or alternately, if one has software projects that people have expressed interest in, but say, you need a 501c3 for us to give you some money to work on it. Like,
So the question is how do you set up a charity particularly if you have a donor hot to give you money and says, well, we can give you some money right away, but we need you to have a C3 charity. You should look at things like Conservancy. I know I'm pitching my own thing, but Conservancy is not the only option. There's a lot of charity homes out there. Conservancy is one. Software in the Public Interest is another. Eclipse Software Foundation is another. I'm missing some, I'm sure. What's that? Okay, so what's it called? NumFocus. Okay, so there's a lot of there's some I don't even know of because somebody's shouting one for the audience I don't know. So there's lots of what are called fiscal sponsor organizations, and what fiscal sponsor means is not that they give you money, but they allow you to join them as an organization or some way affiliate. Conservancy is an actual join process. Other ones it's just an affiliation, but there's a way to get a C3 to take the money for you and spend it towards their mission that happens to relate to your project. That's usually the best way, and often, as is true with Conservancy, SPI, lots of them, you can leave later. So if you want to form an organization later, you can do that and you can leave. Like Conservancy has a 60-day. If you have another C3 that you've started, 60 days you can transfer. Now, starting your own C3 is a lot of work. Like I said, there's carcasses everywhere of people who try to start charities. And also, I don't want to get into too much detail because there's more questions, but there's actually an issue with the IRS granting new C3 status for organizations that are related to open source and free software, which you should see me offline and I'll tell you a long torrid tale of how much it takes right now to get C3 status if you're a free software or open source thing. So I saw a hand up towards this section. I think it was yours, yeah.
Do you have experience partnering with nonprofits from other countries? And about the developers, they must be Americans or can be from anywhere?
So there's two questions there. One is what about nonprofits in other countries? And the second is developers who happen to be contractors to a U.S. nonprofit, can they be from anywhere? As to the first question, the internationalization of nonprofit is almost non-existent. Every single jurisdiction around the world has its own set of nonprofit rules. I know a little bit about how they work in France, a little bit about how they work in Germany. Germany, for example, has the EV structure, and then it has a different type of charity that's less. The Netherlands have stichlings, which are yet another different one. France has the 1904 organizations, and all of these have different sets of rules. So all these rules I'm describing the IRS has about the public good and the charity under 501c3s and then 501c6 trade associations, all completely U.S. specific. And actually, I've investigated heavily how do we internationalize Conservancy so that you could donate in France to a 1904 and somehow give to the project that's in Conservancy. It's really, really tough because in most cases, the money can't leave the country. Like there are rules about how much money given to a French nonprofit can leave France. There's rules in the United States about how much Conservancy could give out to other orgs. So it's really tough to do an international framework. And if you know international organizations, Amnesty International is a great example. There actually isn't one Amnesty International. The main Amnesty International is in the United Kingdom, incorporated as a charity there, and then they license the trademark around the world. So the only relationship between Amnesty International USA and Amnesty International in the UK is a trademark license. And that's the way they've solved this problem, and it just wouldn't really work because the money can't move back and forth except to pay back to the main org. Now, as to developers, it doesn't really matter. The IRS does not really seem to care that we find contractors all over the world to do our free software work, as long as we can show there's a benefit to the public in the United States for them to be writing that software wherever they are. We're very good. Can I take more questions? Okay. Let's keep moving this way. So anybody in this section here? Okay, going further. I saw another hand over here. Okay, go ahead, Dustin.
One comment, you mentioned the choice between getting paid a little bit more or getting to work with public good. There's ways to do both, like Mozilla.
So Mozilla's in it. I didn't want to put a fine point on this, but now you're making me. So he said, well, there's a way to get paid. They're paid like a corporation and also do for the public good. So Mozilla has a complex structure. So Mozilla is a 501c3 charity. The Mozilla Foundation is. And Mitchell Baker, who's the CEO of the Mozilla Corporation and the president of Mozilla Foundation's board, she's a really brilliant lawyer. And she said, well, okay, so we have this problem with our income as a charity when Mozilla first started. And it's this thing called unrelated business taxable income, which is a very complicated IRS thing. But basically, it's money you take not towards your mission that then you're stuck with and have to pay taxes on because you took money that wasn't related to your permission. If you have too much of that, they just take your charity status away. All the money that Google was feeding Mozilla in the early days, and probably still today, was that kind of income. So she said, well, wait a second, there's this other piece of the tax code that says a nonprofit can have a wholly owned for-profit subsidiary that works towards advancing its mission. So she created the Mozilla Corporation, which was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Mozilla Foundation, and then took all the which would be unrelated business taxable income, into the corporation, and made this nice little trick where the corporation just breaks even every year on business expenses, which means it pays no taxes, because a corporation that has no profits pays no taxes, and therefore they paid no taxes across the whole system. The IRS was furious about this. Mozilla spent a number of years in an audit and got a clean bill of health out of it. But I think that after going through that process, it really just is a tribute to how brilliant of a lawyer Mitchell is, that she designed this system and thought of it ahead of time and knew it would work. So but I don't think anybody should try that again, frankly. I think it's dangerous to try that again. But it worked for Mozilla, and they got a clean bill of health, but they spent a lot of years in the audit to get there. Okay, I'm out of time, so I'll be outside if anybody wants to ask more questions.
A round of applause for Bradley. And anyone who wants to continue talking with them as well.